So these two little boys were known troublemakers. They would steal everything that they could get their hands on, even from the church. So one day a pastor stopped one of the boys and really wanted to make the point that they should consider the role of God in their lives the next time they try to steal something. So he asked one of the boys, "Where is God in all this?" The boy shrugged and the pastor repeated, "Where is God?" The boy started tearing up and he ran out of church crying all the way home. And he went and he hid in the closet. Eventually his brother found him and asked, "What's wrong?" The crying boy replied, "We're in trouble now. God is missing and they think we took him." Today we continue our series, Ever Wonder Why? As Jay mentioned, periodically over the course of the next few months, we're going to explore some of the common questions of the Christian faith. Because it's important to ask these questions. One of the things I have noticed is that we often don't wrestle with them until something happens in our lives that forces us to. And it's often difficult in those moments when you feel like things are spiraling out of control to be able to make sense of things. Where you question your relationship with God because God is not responding the way you would want God to. I am sure many of you know someone who gave up on their faith because it just didn't make sense to them intellectually. So it's important for us to wrestle with these questions. For the last few weeks, Jay addressed the question, why do bad things happen? It's one of the most common questions you will hear from a skeptic or someone really struggling with their faith. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to check them out online and maybe even forward it on to someone you know who could benefit from it. Today we're going to address another common question, and that is, why can't I feel God's presence? I have heard this from many people. I wish I can have that mountaintop experience, that feeling, that assurance that God is truly with me. And for many, this can be extremely frustrating, especially during times of stress and hardship. It would be nice if I could definitively know that the God of the universe is with me right now. And you may have heard stories of someone's amazing experience and thought, what is wrong with me that I have experienced something similar? If that's the case for you, it might be helpful to know that you are far from alone in that. The book of Psalms is full of emotional ups and downs of being in a relationship with God. Scripture as a whole is full of people wondering why God was silent at times. Even some of the Christians that we look up to, like Mother Teresa, openly talk about the fact that they rarely experience a feeling of God's presence. So the fact that you can feel God's presence is a common experience, even among those who we expect to feel close to God. In my own journey, I have experienced the ups and downs of this. Before going into seminary, I had a couple of experiences that led me to believe that this is what I should be doing. Where, like John Wesley, my heart was strangely warmed. I was sure that this is what I was called to do. But those feelings and those experiences have been a little too few and far in between for my taste. I would love for a weekly reminder. Heck, I'll even take an annual reminder. But that hasn't been my experience. There have been more times where if I just trusted my feelings, that I would have experienced God distance as opposed to near me. But what I have come to learn is that there are a couple of roadblocks that we encounter when we ask this question. The first is this: how we perceive God is how we expect to experience God. How we perceive God is how we expect to experience God. So if you view God as this giant judge who you're afraid of, who is just waiting for you to mess up, if that is how you view God, then when you feel like you have done wrong or feel guilty about something, you may believe that God has retreated far away from you. Or if you view God as this giant vending machine where you insert your prayer and God is supposed to do everything that you ask, then when it doesn't happen, you will think that God doesn't care about you. Or if you view God as someone who is there to coach you to keep your life trouble-free and successful, well, you are setting yourself up for disappointment. The fact is that our finite minds cannot fully comprehend an infinite God. And when we try to shrink God down to our level, then we will go through life looking for experiences that God never intended for us to have. So it's important for us to understand that we worship a God who we can't call on a whim, a God who we don't control. The next roadblock, when thinking about that question, lies within the question itself. Why can't I feel God's presence? Often, our feelings are not a good indicator of what reality is. There are days when I feel like I am not loved. But that doesn't mean that I'm not. There are days when I feel discarded and unappreciated, but that doesn't make it true. You see, our feelings are fickle. There are just days when I wake up and I'm just feeling good and everything is right in my life. And other days when I wake up and things aren't feeling good. In our passage this morning, in Psalm chapter 13, we find David crying out to God. He finds himself in a time of great turmoil. God has chosen David to be king, but Saul was still the king. And he was enjoying the comforts of the palace while David is still sleeping in caves. And what made it worse was Saul was the bad guy. He didn't care for the things of God, and now Saul is trying to kill David, even though David had previously spared his life. So he cries out to God. So let's read this together. Like I said, it comes from Psalm chapter 13. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death, and my enemy will say, I have prevailed. My foes will rejoice, because I am shaken. But I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, because he has dealt bountifully with me. During that time, David did not feel the presence of God. Things were not going well in his life, so he was tempted to assume that God had just left him. But I think the key to this passage is the end. He says, but I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. Even in that moment, when he didn't feel God's presence. He still trusted in God's love. You see, faith isn't the same as feelings. Faith is knowing that God is present when we feel happy or when we feel sad. Knowing that God is present when we feel like God is next door or a million miles away. David chose to trust God even when he didn't feel God. So how can we hold on to our faith in God and experience God even when we don't feel it? Focus on God and not your feelings. The problem with concentrating on our own feelings is that it can distract us from God. There are so many aspects of God to occupy our hearts and our minds. The beauty of creation. The vastness of the universe, Jesus' life here on earth, his teachings, his death and resurrection. Spend time in silence, reading scripture, contemplating, or in prayer. The more we open up our minds to who God is, the more we will be struck with the feeling and a sense of awe and wonder. What I have noticed is that the more you focus on something, the more you begin to see it everywhere. I don't know about you, but I've been in the market for a new car before. And this probably happens to some of you. When you have an eye out for a car, all of a sudden, what happens? You see it everywhere. In the same way, the more you seek to know God, the more you will see God at work. Secondly, step outside of yourself. I think too often we get so stuck in ourselves and how we feel that we fail to see that God is at work in so many places visibly. Get involved in a ministry, a food pantry, a shelter, or any place. Often we can clearly experience God's presence by being in the spaces where God is calling us to. And there are more, but lastly, for today, look for God's movement as you look back on your life. Many of you took part in telling your stories here at church, where you looked back on your life and realized that God was clearly at work during various points. Too often we're too distracted in the moment and we fail to realize God's movement in our lives. So look back on the journey that brought you here to the present. And very often you will find that God was indeed present. I still remember one day a few years ago when our family decided to go to the mall. And my son Nathan was, I think, about 7 years old at the time, and he was mad because we wouldn't buy him something he really wanted. So he said, "You know what? I don't need you anymore." And he stomped off. So I called out to him and I said, "Nathan, don't go too far." And he responds with, "I'm 7 years old. I can go where I want." So I let him go. And this was a big mall. And he walks away and I decide, you know what? I'm not going to stop him, but I'll just quietly and slowly follow him from a distance and just see how far he gets. And he got far. I mean, he must have made it almost to the other side of the mall, and this mall was big. And there are people on the way who are looking at him, and they're about to ask him, if he's lost and if he needs some help. And then they see me in the background a few yards away going like this and trying to call them off, and they must have thought that I was crazy. But eventually, Nathan stops. And he looks around and he realizes that he is really far from where he started and has no idea where we are. And I can tell by the look on his face that he realized he made a huge mistake. But he finally sees me, and There's this look of relief and still kind of defiance on his face. And he asked me, how did you find me? And I told him, I never lost you because I was following you the whole time. And I still remember his response as he says defiantly, I didn't feel you. And with his fist, but I should have known. Just because we don't always feel it doesn't mean that God isn't there. It's like the sun on a cloudy day. Just because the clouds are covering it doesn't mean the sun isn't there shining like it always does. And there are many things that cloud our ability to experience God's presence. Sometimes it's whatever is going on within us. Sometimes it's just due to the fact that we are finite beings trying to comprehend an infinite God. Often, it's due to the fact that mature faith and trust shouldn't have to rely on our feelings. So my prayer for you and for me is that we continue to grow in faith and trust, knowing that the God who we worship is present and at work in, around, and among us.